I watched her, standing there with a rifle aimed at my prized bull. She said it was property damage. But she forgot one tiny thing. You can't just shoot someone's livestock without consequences. This is how a Karen made the worst mistake of her life, by messing with my bull. Freeze frame, yep. That's me. The guy whose private well HOA Karen tapped into to illegally water her garden. What did I do? I flushed her system with sewage. And oh buddy, that was just the beginning. Viewer instantly wonders, wait, what? How do you even pull that off legally? And how does she not notice? Let me take you back a few months. See, I've got a farm. Not a giant sprawling estate, but enough land to get a little privacy, raise some animals, and do my thing. I'm not exactly the city guy type. I'm more about getting my hands dirty, fixing my tractor, and watching my prize-winning bull, Maximus, graze in peace. The whole vibe is quiet, laid back, and blissfully free from HOA drama. Or at least, it used to be. Enter Debbie, aka the HOA Karen. She came into my life like a storm cloud. Apparently, Maximus's majestic presence and my unkempt yard, which to her was a disaster zone, were devaluing the neighborhood. I mean, who knew that a 1,500-pound bull could be such a threat to real estate prices, right? This wasn't your typical HOA manager. Debbie had this obsession with control, and she was convinced that if she could mold the neighborhood into her own personal Pinterest board, everything would be perfect. Too bad she never got the memo that bulls and their freedom don't exactly fit her manicured lawn aesthetic. I had my first run-in with Debbie over something as ridiculous as my mailbox. You know, the kind of thing that only an HOA could get mad at. The size of it, the color, the angle at which it was positioned. Seriously, I could hear the chainsaw whirring in her head as she plotted to cut me down like a tree in a forest. First, it was the mailbox. Then it was the fence. Then it was the unsightly vegetable garden I had going in the back. Because how dare I grow my own food without consulting her on the type of soil I was using? But here's the thing, I don't buckle easily. I might have ignored her letters at first, but when she started slapping fines on my door, I decided it was time to get creative. You see, I don't just fight back with words. I prefer to make my points with action, legally and within the limits of the law. And that's when I made her mistake. I decided to teach her how a little thing called property rights worked. It wasn't long before she learned that messing with my farm wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a mistake. Here's where it gets interesting. You see, Debbie's obsession with controlling the neighborhood led her to get a little too comfortable with my property. Her house, like a lot of others in the area, was a bit on the edge of the community, close to the edge of my land. At some point, I noticed that her garden had started looking a lot more vibrant than it should have been. I had some suspicions, but when I investigated, I found the real kicker. She had been tapping into my private well to water her garden. Without asking, without permission, and without a care in the world. She just assumed I wouldn't notice. Big mistake. You see, I don't take kindly to people taking what's mine. Sure, I could have just gone to the HOA or reported her for theft, but no. I had something much more creative in mind. I knew the system she was using, the one that took my water for her little suburban oasis, and I also knew that there was a way I could flush it. And I don't mean flush like turning off the tap and calling it a day. No, I mean I could give her water system a little upgrade. You wouldn't believe the fun I had with this one. I flushed her system with sewage. That's right, sewage. I'm not even sure she ever realized what was happening. I timed it just right, so it wasn't enough to cause any major damage, but enough to make her garden look like a toxic wasteland. The best part? She never connected the dots. I could have been just some mystery neighbor who was out to get her. She had no idea I was the one who'd given her Garden of Paradise, a makeover that would make even the hardest of horticulturists weep. So there she was, Debbie, trying to make my life hell with her HOA letters and fake complaints, thinking she was in the clear, while I had already set the stage for her downfall. And this is where she made her next big mistake, messing with Maximus. Now let's talk about the bull. Maximus wasn't just any bull. He was a prize-winning show bull, huge, intimidating, and as loyal as they come. He wasn't some random animal you could shoo away with a broom or yell at until it left. He was my pride and joy, and I was damn proud of him. I'd spent months training him, making sure he looked perfect, and of course, he was great with people. But to Debbie? He was just another unsightly nuisance, an animal that didn't belong in her perfect neighborhood. One afternoon, I got a call from a neighbor who told me Debbie was out in her yard, screaming about Maximus eating her flowers. Now, I'd seen Maximus graze a few times near her yard, but he was hardly the type to go tearing up someone's flower bed. But Debbie, of course, didn't see it that way. She'd been suffering from the bull's presence for months, and in her mind, this was the last straw. Debbie stormed over to my property with her angry little posse of HOA board members, and that's when things went from petty to full-on ridiculous. She started shouting at me from the road, telling me to get Maximus off the common property that was somehow, according to her, part of her kingdom. I asked her if she had ever heard of property rights, but of course that was too much for her. She wanted to make a statement, so she marched up to Maximus and pulled out a rifle. Yep, she had a rifle, and before I could stop her, she aimed it right at Maximus. "Property damage," she screamed, as if the bull had any clue what the word meant. Now, I'm not exactly a fan of confrontation, but no one hurts my animals, and certainly not over some petty HOA complaint. My heart was racing, but I stayed calm. Maximus was just chewing on some grass, completely oblivious to the chaos unfolding around him. But this was the moment. I couldn't let her get away with it. I needed to stop her from doing something stupid, but I also knew it was time for my revenge. And that's when I remembered, you can't just shoot livestock without consequences. Oh, Debbie, you're about to learn exactly why. Stay tuned. As I stood there, watching Debbie point a rifle at Maximus, everything seemed to slow down. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't even really all that surprised. This was just the logical escalation of the petty war we'd been waging for months. But this was a whole new level of crazy. I could see the whites of her eyes as she steadied the rifle. The ridiculousness of the situation was almost laughable if it weren't so damn dangerous. She was a grown woman, standing in front of me, ready to shoot my prized bull over a patch of grass, as if it was some kind of personal vendetta. Now, I'm not saying I'm a perfect rancher or that I know everything about handling confrontations, but one thing I do know is this. You never shoot an animal without a damn good reason. Maximus wasn't some wild beast roaming free in the neighborhood. He wasn't even charging at her like some rampaging bull in a rodeo. He was just standing there, chewing on the grass like any other day, minding his business. But to Debbie, this bull represented everything she hated about my farm, everything she saw as imperfect in her little HOA-run world. "Get your damn bull off my property!" Debbie screamed, her finger twitching on the trigger. She was shaking, visibly agitated, but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. Instead, I stood still, hands out in front of me, trying to keep the situation from escalating further. I knew I had to do something before she made a huge mistake. "Debbie," I said, my voice calm, trying to diffuse the situation. "You really want to do this?" I motioned to Maximus, who was still just standing there, looking completely innocent. "He's not the one you're angry at. He's just trying to enjoy his afternoon." "Property damage," she yelled again, her voice shrill. "He's tearing up the lawn. You think I'm going to let that slide?" I sighed inwardly, trying to keep my cool. I could feel the tension in the air, thick as molasses. This wasn't about the bull. It never was. This was about Debbie and her obsession with control. I wasn't going to let her bully me into giving in to her demands anymore. Maximus, probably sensing the tension, took a few steps back. He wasn't the type to cause trouble, but he wasn't about to let someone point a gun at him without feeling a little bit threatened. I could see him shifting his weight, ready to bolt if he had to. And that was the last thing I needed right now, an unpredictable animal and a crazy woman with a rifle. "Put the gun down, Debbie," I said, my voice firm now. "You really don't want to do this. There are laws about this kind of thing, you know." She snorted, clearly not interested in anything that wasn't her version of justice. "Laws? Please. I'm protecting my property," she spat, her eyes narrowing in that way that people do when they think they're invincible. "He's costing me money, ruining my lawn. I'm not going to let him run roughshod over my hard work." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This woman was standing here, in broad daylight, threatening to shoot my livestock over a garden she thought she owned. And the nerve! She had the audacity to act like she was in the right. It took every ounce of restraint I had not to laugh in her face. But it wasn't time to laugh. It was time to act. I had to stop her, and I had to do it now. My first instinct was to rush forward, grab the rifle, and wrestle it out of her hands, but I knew that would just escalate things even further. If I made a sudden move, I could be dealing with more than a simple HOA dispute. I needed to play this carefully. Then I remembered something. I wasn't just some average guy she could push around. I had the law on my side. And while Debbie seemed convinced that she could do whatever she wanted without consequences, she had one very large, glaring oversight. You can't just shoot someone's livestock without cause, at least not without serious legal repercussions. And I was about to make her regret not thinking that through. "Debbie, you're making a huge mistake," I said, taking a step closer. "If you shoot that bull, you're going to be in more trouble than you can handle. You might think you're in the right, but I've got enough knowledge to make sure you'll regret it for the rest of your life." Her grip tightened on the rifle. "Don't tell me what I can and can't do. This is my property, and I'll protect it however I see fit." I could feel the anger building inside me. I had dealt with enough of her nonsense to last a lifetime, but now she was threatening Maximus, the one thing I truly cared about on that land. And I wasn't going to let that slide. "Listen, Debbie," I said, taking another step toward her. "I've been patient with you. I've let you slide on your ridiculous complaint. I've let you waste the HOA's time with petty rules and fines. But if you think you can walk onto my property, pull a rifle on my bull, and walk away without consequences, you're sorely mistaken. I'll make sure you regret this." She hesitated, and for a moment, I thought I had gotten through to her. But then the crazy look in her eyes returned. She was too far gone, caught up in her own delusion that she was the hero in this story. I could see it in her posture. Her finger was tightening on the trigger. Just as I was about to take another step toward her, a loud voice cut through the air. "Debbie, stop." I turned around to see my neighbor, Carl, rushing toward us. He had been watching from his porch, and I had no idea he was even paying attention. Carl was a soft-spoken guy, a retired cop, and he had been nothing but kind to me since I moved here. He could see what was happening and wasn't about to let it escalate further. Carl moved in between Debbie and me, hands raised in a calm, disarming gesture. "Put the rifle down, Debbie," he said, his voice firm but steady. "You're not in the right here." Debbie glared at him, her face turning red with frustration. "This is none of your business, Carl," she spat, but Carl wasn't backing down. "I think it is," he replied unfazed. "You can't shoot someone's livestock without facing serious charges. You're about to make a big mistake. Put the gun down." The tension was so thick I thought I could cut it with a knife. For a few moments, Debbie stood frozen, rifle still aimed at Maximus, her fury bubbling over. Then, slowly, she lowered the gun, her eyes burning with defeat. But as she backed away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Debbie had crossed a line, and I knew she wasn't the type to give up easily. She would find a way to strike back, and when she did, I was going to be ready. The moment she walked away, I let out a long breath I didn't even know I was holding. Maximus was still calm, still chewing on his grass like nothing had happened. But I knew things were only just getting started. I wasn't the only one with a few tricks up my sleeve, and the next move was mine. The game was on, and I had just made my first move. It didn't take long for the fallout from the rifle incident to spread through the neighborhood. Word travels fast in a tight-knit community like this one, and within hours, everyone knew that Debbie had pulled a gun on me, and more importantly, on my bull. Carl, the retired cop, was a big help. He made sure to spread the word to anyone who would listen, including the local sheriff. He wasn't going to let her get away with it, and neither was I. But the truth was, I knew this was far from over. Debbie wasn't just going to let it slide, and I wasn't the kind of guy to back down. So I did what I do best. I got to work. I wasn't about to let Debbie continue her HOA reign of terror. I had already been building a case for months. Every time she'd sent one of her absurd complaints, I'd documented it. Every phone call, every nasty letter, I'd kept a record. And I had something even more powerful in my arsenal, my knowledge of the law. It wasn't just about defending Maximus or my property anymore. It was about sending a message. Debbie had crossed a line, and it was time for her to feel the consequences of her actions. I started with a simple strategy: expose her hypocrisy. I wasn't just going to sit back and let her continue with her tirades. I needed to make sure everyone knew what kind of person she really was. So I began gathering evidence. Photos, recordings, anything I could use to show the neighborhood just how out of control she'd become. I knew people would be reluctant to speak out against her, but when the truth came to light, they'd have no choice but to turn on her. One of the first things I did was reach out to my neighbors who had been on the receiving end of her HOA complaint. There were plenty of them. People who had been fined for ridiculous reasons, told they couldn't park their RVs in their own driveways or put up a birdbath because it didn't meet the standards. I knew they'd been frustrated with her for a long time, but they hadn't had the guts to say anything. Now I was giving them an outlet. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who'd suffered under her petty rule. I was making it my mission to show them that they didn't have to live in fear of this woman anymore. I set up a meeting with Carl, the neighbor who'd helped defuse the situation with the rifle. I needed someone who understood the law and who could be an ally in this fight. Carl had been a cop for over 20 years, and while he wasn't exactly in the business of going after HOA bullies, he knew how to navigate situations like this. He also knew Debbie. He'd dealt with her in the past, and he wasn't exactly a fan of her antics. We sat in my living room one afternoon, going over everything I had gathered. Carl read through the HOA's bylaws, and we both laughed at how many of them were completely arbitrary and nonsensical. There were rules about grass length, the type of flowers you could plant, even the size of your trash cans. It was clear that the HOA wasn't about maintaining a community. It was about control, and Debbie was the self-appointed queen. But as Carl pointed out, she had her weaknesses. And those weaknesses were my ticket to taking her down. "I've been doing some thinking," Carl said as he put down the papers. "You've got a solid case. You've got evidence, and you've got witnesses who can testify to her harassment. But there's one thing you're missing: public exposure." I raised an eyebrow. "Public exposure?" He nodded. "Yeah. You need to go public with this. Social media, word of mouth, whatever it takes. People need to know who Debbie really is. You're not just fighting her, you're fighting the whole HOA system. And trust me, there are plenty of people who would love to see her brought down." I liked the sound of that. I'd always been a fan of taking matters into my own hands, but Carl's suggestion had a certain appeal to it. We could use Debbie's own tactics against her, turn the tables and make sure she wasn't just another Karen in a suburban nightmare. We were going to make her a cautionary tale. That night, I put together a post for the neighborhood Facebook group. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. I just outlined everything that had been going on. The constant fines, the ridiculous complaints, the fact that Debbie had been using the HOA to make everyone's lives miserable. I also made sure to mention the rifle incident, making it clear that I wasn't the only one who had been targeted. I kept it professional, but it wasn't hard to tell that this was going to be a bombshell. I hit post and waited. It didn't take long for the comments to start pouring in. People were shocked. Some of them were horrified by what had happened with Maximus. Others were relieved to finally see someone standing up to Debbie. But what surprised me the most was the number of people who had their own stories to share. It seemed like everyone had been bullied by the HOA at some point, and now they were finally willing to speak up. By the end of the night, the post had gone viral in the neighborhood. People were sharing it, commenting on it, and tagging others who had been affected by Debbie's antics. Within hours, I was getting messages from people who were ready to back me up, who were willing to testify about the things they'd been through. Debbie's grip on the neighborhood was starting to slip. The next morning, Debbie called me. She was furious, of course. She'd seen the post, and she wasn't happy about it. She tried to guilt-trip me, telling me that I was ruining her reputation, that I was making her out to be a monster. But I didn't feel sorry for her. I wasn't going to back down. I told her that she had brought this upon herself, and that she couldn't hide behind her little HOA forever. She threatened to call the police on me, but I wasn't intimidated. I had already done my homework. I knew exactly what laws she had broken, and I was ready to take her on in court if I had to. But it wasn't just the legal battle I was preparing for. It was the social one. Debbie had made a big mistake by messing with Maximus, and now, thanks to social media, everyone knew about it. The tide was turning. The power was shifting, and I wasn't going to let it slip away. That afternoon, Carl and I met again. We went over everything, what Debbie's next move would be, how we'd deal with the inevitable fallout, and what steps we needed to take to make sure she couldn't get away with what she'd done. I had no intention of letting her off the hook, not this time. This time, I was going to make sure she faced the consequences of her actions. But as I sat there with Carl, plotting the next steps, something nagged at me. This wasn't just about Maximus anymore. This was about every person Debbie had ever tried to push around. And if she thought she could win this fight, she was in for a rude awakening. Debbie had no idea what was coming for her. She thought she could bully me into submission, that she could control the HOA and get away with everything. But I wasn't going to let her. The war had only just begun. And by the time I was done, she was going to wish she'd never pointed that rifle at my bull. Things escalated quickly after that post went live. What started as a small act of defiance quickly turned into an avalanche. The comments kept flooding in, and by the end of the first day, the post had gone viral in the neighborhood. People were sharing their own stories, many of them about Debbie and the way she had tormented them over the years. It wasn't long before the local news picked up the story. I hadn't planned for any of this, but it felt good to finally see Debbie getting a taste of her own medicine. Her reign of terror was starting to crumble, and I was loving every minute of it. Debbie didn't take kindly to any of this. The following day, she showed up on my doorstep, furious. Her face was red, her hands shaking with anger, and she wasn't alone. She'd brought the entire HOA board with her, all of them standing behind her like some sort of armed entourage. They were there to discuss the situation, but we all knew what that really meant. They were there to intimidate me, to try and make me take down the post and retract my statements. They thought they could bully me into submission like they'd done to so many others. But I wasn't backing down. Not this time. I could see it in Debbie's eyes. She was desperate. She had underestimated me, and now she was paying the price. I'd built a solid case, not just legally but socially. The neighborhood was turning against her, and she knew it. The people who had been afraid of her for years were starting to find their voices, and they weren't going to let her get away with this. I stood there, arms crossed, smiling to myself as she raged in front of me. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. "You have no idea what you've done," Debbie screamed. "You've ruined everything. I'm going to make sure you regret this. You and your bull, you think you're untouchable. I let her rant for a while. I wasn't interested in hearing her excuses or her threats. It was just noise at this point. Debbie, I finally said, interrupting her tirade. You've made a lot of enemies in this neighborhood. You've bullied people for years and now, finally, people are standing up to you. I'm just the beginning. She froze for a moment, the reality of what was happening sinking in. What do you mean by that? She asked, her voice lower now, but still full of venom. I mean, I said, taking a step forward, you've made your life about controlling everyone around you. You've used the HOA to harass people, fine them for ridiculous things, and make their lives miserable. But it's over now. The people you've tormented are waking up, and you can't hide behind your little HOA board anymore. You're done. Debbie's face twisted in anger, but this time, there was a hint of fear in her eyes. She was realizing the extent of what she had done. She had pushed too far, and now the walls were closing in. The more she raged, the more the people around her began to pull away. I could see the board members glancing at each other, unsure of how to handle the situation. I knew they were starting to realize that they had been following the wrong leader. Debbie was no longer their golden girl. The tide was shifting, and they knew it. She tried one last desperate attempt to turn the situation in her favor. I'm calling the police, she spat. You've broken the law by posting all of this. I'll have you arrested for defamation. I could see her mind racing, trying to come up with some way to get out of this, but I wasn't worried. The truth was on my side, and I knew it. Go ahead, I said, smiling. But you might want to check your own legal situation first. You can't just shoot someone's livestock without facing consequences. And your little HOA fines? Those aren't as legal as you think. You've been overstepping your bounds for too long. Debbie's jaw clenched as she realized the truth in my words. She had been playing a dangerous game, and now it was catching up with her. I wasn't afraid of her or her threats. I had already contacted a lawyer, and I had more than enough evidence to make sure she couldn't get away with any of this. And now, thanks to the viral post, the whole neighborhood knew what kind of person she really was. She couldn't hide behind her power anymore. I watched as Debbie's face twisted with frustration. She wanted to lash out, to shout, to throw some last-ditch effort at me, but she couldn't. The people she'd been terrorizing for so long were done with her. The support she thought she had was slipping away, and she was left standing there with nothing but her own anger. She turned on her heels, her board members following her in a half-hearted procession. They weren't sure what to do, but I could see them starting to realize that they'd made a huge mistake by following her blindly. It wasn't just me they had to worry about anymore, it was everyone she had wronged over the years. They had seen the flood of support that came in the wake of my post, and they knew that the community wasn't going to let Debbie's abuses slide anymore. As they walked away, I couldn't help but feel a rush of satisfaction. I had done it. I had taken down the queen of the HOA, and it felt damn good. But I knew this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. Debbie would keep fighting. She would try to manipulate her way out of this, try to turn things around, but I was ready for whatever she threw my way. The war wasn't over, but I had just won a major battle. The next few days were a blur. I spent my time tying up legal loose ends, making sure I had everything in place to keep Debbie from retaliating. I didn't expect her to just walk away quietly. She was stubborn, and she would try to find a way to strike back. But I was ready. In the meantime, the neighborhood continued to rally behind me. The people who had been afraid to speak up finally found their voices. The HOA board, realizing that their golden girl was no longer untouchable, started to distance themselves from Debbie. They saw what was happening, and they weren't about to lose their positions over her. The final blow came when the HOA, after reviewing everything, issued a public apology to me. They removed all fines and restrictions on my property, acknowledging that they had overstepped their bounds. The apology was one of those half-hearted, legally worded statements that didn't mean much, but it was enough. It was a victory, a small but important one. And as for Debbie? Well, she tried to fight back, but the community wasn't on her side anymore. The public backlash was enough to make her pack up and move out of the neighborhood. The farewell party they threw for her wasn't exactly what she had hoped for. There was no one left to back her up. She had burned every bridge she had, and she walked away with nothing. I stood there, watching her go, a sense of satisfaction washing over me. Maximus, my loyal bull, trotted past me, giving me a nod of approval. This time I had won.